I would now like to welcome to the stage Professor Tim Geraghty, the President of the Australasian Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine, to introduce the George Burniston Oration. Thanks,
Tim. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce the George Burniston Orator for 2019. Professor Chris Poulos is a rehabilitation medicine physician and served as President of the Australasian Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine from 2012 to 2014. He's the conjoint professor in the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of New South Wales and visiting professorial fellow at the Australian Health Services Research Institute at the University of Wollongong. In his current role as Head of Research and Aged Care Clinical Services for rehabilitation and aged care provider Hammond Care, he's led the development of community-based rehabilitation and restorative care programs for older people. His clinical and research interests include ambulatory rehabilitation, restorative care and reablement programs, the use of arts to promote health and well-being, the wellness needs of carers of people living with dementia, and rehabilitation and aged care service delivery. He has a master's degree in health policy and management and was awarded his PhD in 2012. George Burniston, for whom this oration is named, was a pioneer of rehabilitation medicine in Australia and New Zealand. One of the things that he learnt very early in his career was that for people impaired through injury or illness, excellence in medical and surgical care often wasn't enough unless it was also combined with a focus on assisting people to reach their maximum level of independence and participation in society. In other words, he was interested in function. It's my great pleasure to ask Professor Chris Poulos to present the George Burniston Oration.
Right, thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction. And I'm very honoured to be here to deliver the Burniston Oration. And I thank you very much to the college for facilitating this. I've titled the oration Function. It's just one word, it's a very simple word, but it's a word that's central to rehabilitation medicine. I'm going to speak about the importance of function in medicine. I'm going to talk about the classification of function, a little bit about function throughout the life course, and the rehabilitation or function focus approach to patient care. And then I'm going to just finish up with some observations about how well our health and aged care systems and our disability and aged care sectors support function. But first, a few words about George Burniston. I actually don't recall ever meeting George Burniston. If I did, it was a rehabilitation registrar in the 1980s, when I didn't really know much about the history of the specialty in Australia or appreciated who was who. But I do recall an oration given by Professor Richard Jones in 2010 titled George Garrett Burniston, The Man, the Mission and the Memory. In my searching about George Burniston, I came across an unlikely source of information about him from the June 12, 1968 edition of the Australian Women's Weekly, which was, at the time, actually a weekly publication. My mother was an avid reader of the Women's Weekly in 1968, and she gave away old copies of her magazines to doctors' receptionists. Her copy of that June 1968 edition is still, no doubt, gracing the waiting rooms of a surgeon somewhere in Sydney. I had to go online to find information, and this is the actual cover of that particular edition. So inside is a story about George Burniston and his role as head of rehabilitation at the Prince Henry Hospital. It speaks about him giving an upcoming plenary session at the 3rd Australian Medical Congress in Sydney, which was going to be in August of that year, in which 2,500 doctors from Australia and overseas will meet in the largest medical assemblage ever seen in Australia. George Burniston championed the role of rehabilitation medicine in getting people back to work, especially following injury, and in the article he pointed to the great increase in injury from road traffic accidents and from the often dangerous techniques of modern industry. But he also noted in that 1968 article that society is ageing, and because people are living longer, there is an increase in chronic ills, such as affections of the joints, and older people too are subject to injury from falls and accidents. There are 3 very nice snippets in that article about George Burniston. George Burniston is quoted as saying, "If medical science is keeping people alive, it must help them towards the fullest life that they can live." And we want all doctors and all patients to think in terms of rehabilitation at the very onset of illness or injury. And finally, the writer of the article states that George Burniston knows every patient, not as a problem, but as a person. So I'll just digress a little. Incidentally, in the same edition of the Woman's Weekly, we also got to meet the new Ford Cortina, as a nicer looking car as you've ever seen, and with a whole host of safety features, including seatbelts, a fully padded dash, and push-button windscreen washers. And all for only $1,798, which was about 27 times average weekly earnings in 1968. Today, a Hyundai i30, also a model with windscreen washers, costs around only 13 weeks average full-time earnings. So in 50 years, a lot has changed since that article was published, in cars and in medicine, and the rate of change is only increasing. Fortunately, cars and workplace safety have become much safer. But some things haven't changed, and that is the role of rehabilitation in helping people regain and maintain lost function caused by injury or illness, and where that is not possible, to help people adapt to lost function. So in keeping with George Burniston's life work as a doctor, let me talk about the importance of function in medicine. It is how someone functions that is of key importance to them. And loss of function is often what prompts people to seek healthcare or supportive services. So for our patients, function matters. But functional status itself is also a potent predictor of health outcomes and of survival. There are numerous examples available that illustrate this, mostly pertaining to older people. For example, in terms of gait speed, predicted survival based on age, sex and gait speed has been shown to be as accurate as that based on age, sex, chronic conditions, smoking history, blood pressure, body mass index and hospitalisation. There is, of course, a basis for gait speed being a useful predictor of survival, given that it is impacted by a number of body systems as well as by psychological, lifestyle and behavioural factors. In other studies of hospitalised patients, functional ability, as measured by the Functional Independence Measure, or FIM, has been shown to be a much better predictor of 6-year survival than the number of medical diagnoses. And of course, some functional decline that does develop from hospitalisation is preventable. The incidence of iatrogenic disability in one study of hospitalised older patients was 12%, and 82% of such disability was preventable. And back in 1994, we did a very simple study looking at bed rest in a Sydney teaching hospital. We found that on surveying the hospital at one point in time, one afternoon, 67% of patients were in bed, with 42% of those not having any requirement to be in bed. They simply had nowhere else to go. Repeatedly surveying those patients showed that they were in bed for 63% of the active part of the day. So we can do a lot to prevent preventable functional decline, particularly in our hospitals. In terms of burden on the aged care and social services system and on unpaid carers, limitations in functional ability are a key reason why people need support. In an Australian Health Services Research Institute study to develop a new funding model for residential aged care, that's nursing homes, in which I was involved in, a key consideration of the costing model was whether the nursing home residents' medical diagnosis was a direct driver of resource consumption. And I'll just have some water consumption. The consensus across all clinical panels involved in the study was that it is not diagnosis per se that drives cost, but rather the impact of diagnosis on the person's ability to mobilise, to undertake self-care activities, and to understand their environment. Activity of daily living scores are a proxy for cognition and behaviour, as well as reflecting the resident's underlying diagnosis. And this is actually quite different to the acute case mix model, where diagnosis is really quite reflective of resource consumption for the hospital episode. Another consideration when it comes to function is that as people age, it becomes more common for them to experience significant functional decline in a progressive manner rather than by sudden catastrophic loss following an illness or an injury. And this is important for us to remember because most of our intensive rehabilitation and geriatric services are hospital-based and tend to cater to that latter group, the group that comes in with sudden catastrophic loss of function, which can mean that those who are experiencing progressive loss of function in the community are not able to access some of those more intensive services. Now, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the classification of function because I realise that a number of people in the audience may not have been familiar with how this classification of function developed. During my training, I had a fairly narrow view of how someone functioned. And it was really often limited to the symptoms or clinical signs that patients presented with. I didn't really view function more broadly in terms of how it affected the person in being able to do what was important to them. Whereas the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD, which I think most people are familiar with, classifies disease based on etiology, pathology, and the manifestation of the disease. The International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities and Handicaps, also known as or abbreviated to the ICIDH, which was released by the WHO in 1980, it went on to examine the consequences of disease. The aim of the ICIDH was to provide a unifying framework for classifying the consequences of disease, and it was a complementary classification to the ICD. I first came across the ICIDH as a registrar, and I remember how revolutionary I thought it was, providing new insights on the interplay between disease, disability and functioning and how this impacted the person's participation in life. Within the ICIDH are firstly impairments, and these are defined as disturbances at the level of the organ, such as abnormalities of body structures or appearance, for example, someone with a below-knee amputation, or abnormalities in organ or system functions, for example, reduced cardiac output as a result of cardiac failure. Next comes disabilities, which are disturbances at the level of the person, and they represent the consequences of impairment in terms of functional performance and activity by the individual. For example, an amputee or the person with cardiac failure may both have limitations in mobility or in the performance of other activities of daily living. The final level in the ICIDH is that of handicap, which is concerned with the disadvantages experienced by the individual as a result of impairments and disabilities. Or to put it another way, the limitations on the fulfilment of a role that is normal for that person. One very simple example that was mentioned was someone with the loss of a digit on one hand, a single digit. The degree of handicap that person might experience is very dependent on their occupation, with a concert pianist potentially being extremely handicapped. However, handicap is a word that we've since moved away from, as the concept of participation is now being framed from a more positive perspective. The next iteration of the classification system of function came in 2001 when the WHO published the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, abbreviated to the ICF. The ICIDH had been criticised for not giving adequate recognition to the role of the environment in the creation of disability, and the ICF provided a fuller understanding of the role of these contextual factors. The Icf model presented here shows the interacting elements that determine overall health status. And I'll briefly unpack the ICF for those who are not familiar with it, and it's structured around the following components. Firstly, there's the health condition, and that's an umbrella term for the disease, the disorder or injury. It can also include other circumstances such as pregnancy, ageing, congenital anomalies or genetic predispositions. Health conditions are coded using the ICF. Body functions and structures are the physiological functions of body systems, including mental functions. Body structures are the structural or anatomic parts of the body. Activities are the execution of a task or actions by an individual, and this represents the individual's perspective on functioning. And participation, replacing handicap, denotes the person's involvement in life situations, and this represents a societal perspective on functioning. The ICF uses the term impairments for loss or abnormalities in body functions or structures, activity limitations for difficulties an individual may have in executing activities, and participation restrictions for problems an individual may have in involvement in life situations. The ICF also includes two groups of contextual factors that can impact functioning and participation. These are the environment, such as, for example, the availability of assistive technologies, transportation and social attitudes, and personal factors, such as the person's own attitudes and beliefs, personality and temperament, socioeconomic status, and self-efficacy. So the ICF really presents a common language about function, allowing detailed classification of the impacts of health conditions, which has also led to more rigour in research on the outcomes of interventions. By way of example, this slide shows the work of Australian Rehabilitation Medicine Fellow Fari Khan on how the domains of the ICF might apply in multiple sclerosis. This is a very high-level diagram only, and her work and the work of others has involved the development of detailed core sets for each of those ICF domains. Finally now, I just want to refer to some more recent work from the WHO, because I think it's very relevant to this presentation on function and very relevant to the Congress theme, where we're looking at life course. In 2015, the WHO released the World Report on Ageing and Health. So unlike the ICIDH and the ICF, the World Report is not a classification framework for functioning, but functioning is a central theme. Recognising the maintenance of function is extremely important to people as they age, and that the loss of ability typically associated with ageing is only loosely related to a person's chronological age, the World Report stresses the need to take a life course approach. The World Report introduces the term functional ability, which it defines as the health-related attributes that enable people to be and to do what they have reason to value. Functional ability is made up of the intrinsic capacity of the individual and relevant environmental characteristics, as well as the interaction between the individual and these characteristics. I find that this concept of functional ability being made up of intrinsic capacity and the environment is a useful tool clinically as well, and it's a useful teaching tool. Intrinsic capacity in the model is defined as the composite of all the physical and mental capacities of an individual, and environments comprise all the factors in the extrinsic world relevant to the individual. These include, for example, assistive technologies, how enabling the physical environment is, social policies, and the availability of support services. In really simple terms, intrinsic capacity is what the person is able to achieve without any form of assistance, and the addition of environmental factors allows someone to function beyond what their intrinsic capacity permits. Now, of course, the World Report on Ageing and Health, all coming out of the WHO, as did the ICF and the ICIDH, that the World Report does not suggest that viewing functional ability in this way replaces the ICF, which of course remains a robust classification tool and framework. Now I just want to talk about function across the life course, and I'm also going to draw on work from the WHO here, also out of the World Report. So another concept promoted within the World Report is a framework for healthy ageing across the life course based on 3 functional stages in adulthood. The first being people with high and stable capacity, the second people with declining capacity, and the third people with significant loss of capacity. And the overarching public health response to these functional stages is described across 3 streams. Firstly, health services, secondly, long-term care, and thirdly, the environment. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the framework and unpacking it. The brown element shows strategies that impact intrinsic capacity, and the blue are those that can also influence functional ability. For people with high and stable intrinsic capacity, the focus needs to be on building and maintaining this for as long as possible. For the health system, this especially means the management of risk factors and the early identification and prevention of disease. The environment needs to be supportive of people adopting capacity-enhancing behaviours. For example, taxing tobacco, supporting the adoption of healthy eating, environments that promote regular physical activity, and of course education. It's a long list. During the stage of declining capacity, the emphasis of the health system moves towards disease management and reducing the impact of disease and injury on intrinsic capacity. Now, rehabilitation has a key role in this stage, but other strategies that maintain or reduce the rate of decline in intrinsic capacity, such as regular physical activity and good nutrition, remain important. Environments to continue to play an important role for people with declining capacity by supporting them to participate as far as possible in the activities and roles that are meaningful to them. Assistive technologies become increasingly important, and support services provided by long-term care should also help people maintain functional ability for as long as possible. An emerging concept in the provision of support services for older people is that of reablement, which is a relatively new term, but it's gaining wider use. And reablement is where support services are provided in a way that enables the person to continue doing a task, so described as doing the task with them rather than the service providing the task for them or doing it for them. Take the case, for example, of an older person who has a mobility restriction due to arthritis and a vision restriction due to macular degeneration, which means that they can no longer drive independently. A home-delivered meal service, while convenient, is not as enabling as a service that takes the person shopping so that they continue to mobilise outside of the home, experience cognitive and social stimulation from doing so, and exercise choice, and they're enabled to undertake their own meal preparation. When people have significant loss of capacity, the long-term care system plays a much greater role as the emphasis on assistance with basic living tasks increases. But these tasks will be easier, of course, if an enabling environment is available. The health system still has a significant role to play in optimising the trajectory of intrinsic capacity, even through this latter stage, through continued disease management, pain and symptom management, and by not adversely impacting intrinsic capacity through polypharmacy or causing iatrogenic loss of functional ability during hospitalisation. And this is particularly relevant, of course, because there's a high prevalence of multimorbidity in this group. Even though the WHO framework is described as a public health framework, I also find it clinically useful when dealing with individual patients because it helps to take a broader view of the interventions that can promote function. So I want to move now to the rehabilitation approach to the management of patients with functional decline. And I'll call this a function-focused approach, and it's not unique to rehabilitation medicine. My geriatric medicine colleagues may call this comprehensive geriatric assessment, and other physicians, particularly those dealing with chronic diseases, also embrace a function-focused model. But I like to think that rehabilitation medicine was a pioneer when it comes to helping people maximise their functional ability following illness or injury, and I'm sure that George Burniston would agree. To start, here's a diagram depicting 3 examples of different trajectories of intrinsic capacity throughout adulthood. The blue line is what we might call an ideal trajectory, with capacity remaining high until quite late in life. The orange line depicts the person who has had a sudden catastrophic event resulting in marked loss of function, and the red line depicts the person with chronic disease experiencing progressive loss of functional decline, progressive loss of function. When intrinsic capacity declines to what we call the disability threshold, activity limitations and participation restrictions occur. And of course, this disability threshold varies according to the difficulty and complexity of the task. Walking to the letterbox on the flat is not the same as walking 500 metres up a hill to catch a bus. But how much a person declines in capacity before breaching the disability threshold for a given task is influenced by the amount of reserve capacity that they have. Someone with an ideal health trajectory should retain sufficient reserve capacity to continue doing the tasks required for daily living until very late, which basically means that we should not attribute ageing to significant loss of functional decline. We should be clearly looking for other causes. From a functional perspective, the amount of reserve capacity is extremely important when it comes to the person's response to illness or injury and to the things that we do or neglect to do for them when they're admitted to hospital. Reserve capacity can be built by improving intrinsic capacity or by lowering the disability threshold through the use of assistive technologies, for example, the use of walking aids. As with other branches of medicine, rehabilitation always starts with clinical assessment and the identification of health conditions that contribute to functional decline. This is followed by the assessment of function in a standardised way across a range of domains. And rehabilitation medicine epitomises multidisciplinary assessment and management by working in close collaboration with medical, surgical and nursing colleagues to optimise the management of the patient's health conditions, and with allied health and nursing colleagues to assess and address functional decline. Goals for addressing functional decline need to be realistic and established jointly with the patient and their family or close supports. Goals need to be meaningful to the patient to ensure greatest compliance with therapy, because with most rehabilitation interventions, patients have to work to see gains, and this can take time. Therapies to improve function should be evidence-based wherever possible, but understanding that patients often have multimorbidity and various and varied presentations means that they often don't fit neatly into the clinical trial populations where evidence is generated. Hence, the art of medicine still applies, as does the periodic objective reassessment of function to determine if measurable gains are being made throughout a program. Rehabilitation interventions that are aimed at regaining or maintaining intrinsic capacity, deploying assistive technologies to improve functional ability, helping the patient to adapt to lost function by teaching compensatory strategies, and helping patients and their families to adjust psychologically. Manipulation of the environment, such as modifications to the home, car or workplace, can play a major role in maximising participation and functional ability and independence, as does the provision of support services or even a move to alternative accommodation when needed. To hasten the move from art to science, though, our Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine has established the Australasian Rehabilitation Outcomes Centre, known as AROC, in 2002. AROC is a national rehabilitation medicine clinical registry for Australia and New Zealand, and patient functional outcomes are a central feature. In 2018, AROC reported on 127,000 inpatient rehabilitation episodes in Australia and around 12,800 in New Zealand. And this is near 100% coverage of public and private rehabilitation in both countries. As well as producing unit-specific reports and impairment-specific benchmarking reports, the AROC database is available for interrogation as part of data linkage projects, and that's happening more and more. So briefly back to the diagram of trajectories of intrinsic capacity. Rehabilitation has traditionally had a role in the management of patients who have sustained significant functional loss from acute illness or injury and have landed in hospital. But the rehabilitation or function-focused approach is also valuable in the management of people at risk of or experiencing progressive functional decline as a result of chronic and complex conditions. I'm just going to conclude now with a few comments about how well our health, age and disabilities sectors support function. Compared to the rest of the world, the Australian and New Zealand health systems are pretty good, and I think most would agree, especially when it comes to the availability of medical services, diagnostics, pharmaceuticals and hospital services. If you require hospitalisation following acute illness or injury and have significant loss of function as a result, you will in all likelihood have good access to inpatient rehabilitation, whether you're a public or a private patient. Younger and older people with significant functional loss are eligible for a range of ongoing community support services, although there are certainly gaps in provision. So where can we do better? I'm sure that many in this audience will have their own list, but one area that I expect there would be general agreement on is prevention. In 2017, La Trobe University reported that in Australia, only 1.34% of all health spending goes on prevention. This is equivalent to $89 per person per year and less than spent in Canada, the United Kingdom or New Zealand. If we want to positively impact health along the life course and help people build and maintain intrinsic capacity into older age and build that reserve capacity, then we should be doing more on prevention. But as a rehabilitation physician, the area I want to focus on today is how well our health system supports this function-focused approach in the community, that is, outside of the hospital system. And I'm specifically referring to the lack of access to community-based, coordinated, multidisciplinary allied health services for people with declining capacity. This is something that rehabilitation colleague Peter New and I pointed out in this viewpoint paper published in the Medical Journal of Australia in 2008. And not a lot has changed in this regard since then. The availability in Australia of up to 5 allied health sessions annually under a GP management plan really only scratches the surface. It's not available through physicians and, in my experience, is grossly insufficient to make any meaningful difference to the person's function. Access to hospital-based or community allied health programs is fairly poor, and there is variability between the states. But certainly outpatient services, as we knew them a number of years ago, have not kept pace. I will, however, commend the Australian Government for its new short-term restorative care program, STRC, for people over 65 years of age. This commenced in 2017 with a small but growing national rollout. It's a 56-day community-based multidisciplinary program similar to the existing transition care program. Short-term restorative care complements transition care because STRC is for older people who have functional decline not associated with a hospitalisation, whereas of course the transition care program, which has been around for more than a decade, is only available to people who had had a hospitalisation. Now, this is a very welcome move, but access depends on a fairly tortuous process of referring through the government's My Aged Care portal, following which an aged care assessment team, or ACAT assessment, is required. This adds time and cost to the assessment process when the aim should really be early intervention. So finally, just 4 points to sum up. Firstly, function is important to patients and to health outcomes. So as I said earlier, for our patients, function matters. Throughout the life course, the approach to maximising intrinsic capacity and functional ability and helping people adapt to lost function changes. That approach changes, and we should be mindful of the elements, all of the elements that can work together, though, to help somebody maximise functional ability. When somebody does have significant loss of function due to illness or injury, be it sudden or progressive, a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach is required if we're best to address that functional decline. And finally, I believe that our health and aged care systems can do more to support such an approach, especially by the greater provision of goal-directed and coordinated multidisciplinary allied health programs for people outside of the hospital setting. Physicians with expertise in assessing and managing functional decline should be able to access these programs directly, and they also need to be integrated into primary care. Interventions should be evidence-based where possible, and they should also be subjected to the measurement of outcomes and to benchmarking to make sure that we're getting value for money. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that very interesting and informative presentation. And it's good to see that the Women's Weekly is now being cited in reference lists. Absolutely. So it's my great pleasure to award Chris the George Burniston Medal.